The clock on Jasmine Taylor's dashboard showed 11:43 p.m. as she drove through the quiet streets of Westbrook. Her eyes burned from hours of staring at medical textbooks, and her mind still raced with information about cardiac pathologies. Second-year medical school was everything she had expected: challenging, exhausting, and incredibly rewarding. Tonight's study session at the university library had been particularly productive, and despite her fatigue, a small smile played on her lips. The upcoming exams didn't seem quite as daunting now. Jasmine turned down Maple Avenue, taking the familiar route back to her small apartment. The road was nearly empty at this hour, just a few cars passing by in the opposite direction. She adjusted her rearview mirror and noticed headlights following her. A police cruiser. She hadn't been speeding, but as the blue and red lights suddenly flashed, her heart skipped a beat. "Just great," she muttered, carefully pulling over to the curb. She switched off the radio, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, exactly as her father had taught her years ago. The officer took his time approaching her car, his flashlight beam sweeping across her back seat before landing directly on her face, momentarily blinding her. Jasmine blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the harsh light. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone clipped and unfriendly. "Good evening, officer," Jasmine replied politely. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer, his nameplate read Dawson, stared at her for a moment before responding. "Your right taillight is out. License and registration, please." Jasmine nodded. "I had no idea. Thank you for letting me know. I'll get it fixed tomorrow." She reached slowly for her glove compartment. "I'm just getting my registration, officer." She handed over her documents and waited as Officer Dawson examined them with unnecessary scrutiny. His flashlight lingered on her university ID card. Medical student at Westbrook University. His tone carried obvious disbelief. "That's quite a fancy school." "Yes, sir. I'm in my second year," Jasmine answered, maintaining her composure despite the implied question in his words. Officer Dawson made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. "And how exactly did you manage that?" The question hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. Jasmine felt heat rising to her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Through hard work and dedication, same as everyone else, officer." Dawson handed back her license, but kept the registration. "Step out of the car, please. Is there a problem?" Jasmine asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Just step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his holster. A subtle but clear intimidation tactic. Jasmine complied, carefully exiting her car. The night air was chilly and she hadn't brought a jacket. She wrapped her arms around herself as she stood on the sidewalk. "Have you been drinking tonight?" Officer Dawson asked, shining the flashlight directly in her eyes again. "No, sir. I don't drink. I've been at the library studying since 4 this afternoon." "Studying, huh?" The skepticism in his voice was palpable. "Let's just make sure. Follow my finger with your eyes only." A couple driving by slowed their car to watch the scene unfolding on the roadside. Jasmine felt a wave of humiliation wash over her as Officer Dawson put her through a series of sobriety tests. Walking in a straight line, standing on one foot, reciting the alphabet. Each test she passed without difficulty only seemed to irritate him further. "People like you always think you're special, don't you?" Officer Dawson remarked as she completed the final test flawlessly. "Always claiming to be something you're not." The comment hit Jasmine like a physical blow. She knew exactly what he meant by "people like you." She'd heard variations of this sentiment throughout her life, but it never got easier to bear. Still, she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. "Officer Dawson," she said calmly, memorizing his badge number as she spoke. "I understand you're doing your job, but I've complied with everything you've asked. I'm simply trying to get home after a long day of studying. I wasn't speeding and I didn't know about my taillight. I'll get it fixed first thing tomorrow." A car drove by slowly, the passengers clearly watching the interaction. Jasmine recognized them as residents from her apartment complex. Perfect. More witnesses to her humiliation. Officer Dawson seemed to notice the attention they were attracting. He handed back her registration with obvious reluctance. "I'll let you off with a warning this time. Get that taillight fixed." He paused before adding, "And try to stay in your own neighborhood next time." The implication was crystal clear. This wasn't her neighborhood. She didn't belong here. Never mind that the university library was just 2 blocks away. or that she'd lived in her apartment for over a year. "Yes, officer. Thank you." Jasmine replied automatically, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She waited until he returned to his patrol car before getting back into her own vehicle. As she sat behind the wheel, hands trembling slightly, she took several deep breaths to calm herself. The police cruiser remained parked behind her, its lights still flashing. Jasmine started her car and carefully pulled away from the curb, hyper-aware of every movement she made. In her rearview mirror, she saw the police car make a U-turn and drive off in the opposite direction. Only then did she allow herself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. The assumptions, the disbelief that she could be a medical student, the thinly veiled racist comments, the unnecessary sobriety test, the public humiliation. Jasmine gripped the steering wheel tightly as tears threatened to spill. But she wouldn't cry. Not over this. Not over him. Instead, she pulled over again once she was certain Officer Dawson was gone. She took out her phone and made detailed notes about the encounter, the time, location, the officer's name and badge number, what was said, the unnecessary tests, everything. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced discrimination, but it was the first time it had been so blatant, so public, and from someone with such authority. As class representative for her medical school cohort and a mentor to minority pre-med students, Jasmine knew she had a responsibility to address this incident. She couldn't let it slide, not just for herself, but for everyone who might face Officer Dawson in the future. As she drove the remaining distance to her apartment, Jasmine's initial shock and hurt began to transform into determination. She would call her father in the morning. He would know what to do next, and Officer Dawson would learn that he had picked the wrong person to harass tonight. Jasmine barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the humiliation of standing on the roadside, performing sobriety tests she didn't need while cars drove past. She kept hearing Officer Dawson's voice, the thinly veiled contempt when he questioned her status as a medical student, the dismissive way he said, "people like you." By morning, the knot in her stomach had only tightened. She made herself a cup of strong coffee and sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the notes she'd written immediately after the incident. Reading them again in the harsh light of day made her anger flare anew. She glanced at the clock, 7:30 a.m. Her father would be awake. As chief of surgery at Memorial Hospital, Dr. William Taylor was always up early, preparing for whatever complex procedures awaited him that day. Jasmine hesitated for just a moment before making the call. She hated bringing her problems to her father, hated feeling like she couldn't handle things on her own. But this was different. This was something bigger than her. Her father answered on the second ring. "Morning, sweetheart." His deep voice came through, instantly comforting. "You're up early for a Saturday." "Hi, Dad," Jasmine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you have a minute? Something happened last night." There must have been something in her tone because Dr. Taylor's voice immediately shifted. "What's wrong?" "Are you okay?" "I'm fine physically," Jasmine said. "But I got pulled over last night and—" Her voice caught unexpectedly. She took a deep breath. "I got pulled over and the officer was— He was really inappropriate. Tell me everything," her father said, his tone now serious and focused. Jasmine recounted the entire incident in detail. Officer Dawson's skepticism about her being a medical student, the unnecessary sobriety tests, the comments about people like you, and staying in her own neighborhood. As she spoke, she could almost feel her father's anger building through the phone. When she finished, there was a long pause before Dr. Taylor spoke. "Did you get his name and badge number?" he asked, his voice controlled but tight with anger. "Yes. Officer Richard Dawson, badge number 4872. "Good. And you wrote down everything that happened right after it occurred?" "Yes, Dad, I have detailed notes." "That's my girl," Dr. Taylor said, pride mixing with the anger in his voice. "Now listen to me, Jasmine. This isn't right, and we're not going to let it slide. I want you to file a formal complaint today. Not next week, not when you have time between classes, today." "I know," Jasmine said. "I already decided I need to report him. I'm just not sure about the process." "I'll come with you," her father replied without hesitation. "I have surgery scheduled at 2 p.m., but my morning is clear. I can pick you up in an hour." Jasmine started to protest. "Dad, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted firmly. "Not because you can't handle this, yo. Herself, I know you can, but because this is important. Because I've been dealing with this kind of thing for 30 years longer than you have. And because sometimes, Jasmine, you need to show people exactly who they're dealing with. There was something in his tone that made Jasmine pause. Dad, what are you not telling me? A brief silence, then her father sighed. I was going to mention it at Sunday dinner, but since we're here now, I recently accepted a position on the city's police oversight committee. The mayor appointed me last month as part of an initiative to improve community relations. We haven't had our first official meeting yet, but I've met with the chief and several captains already. Jasmine sat up straighter, suddenly understanding her father's insistence on accompanying her. So you actually have some authority in this situation? Some, Dr. Taylor confirmed. Not direct authority over disciplinary actions, but influence, certainly. And more importantly, visibility. The department is very aware of who I am right now. Jasmine felt a wave of relief wash over her, not because she needed her father to fight her battles. She'd been advocating for herself for years, but because, for once, the power dynamics wouldn't be stacked entirely against her. Be ready in an hour, her father said. And Jasmine? Wear your white coat. She understood immediately. Her white medical coat was a symbol of her status, her education, her legitimate place in spaces that people like Officer Dawson didn't think she belonged. It wasn't about vanity or flaunting credentials. It was about visibility and challenging assumptions. After ending the call, Jasmine showered and dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a light blue button-down shirt, minimal jewelry, and finally, her white coat with Westbrook University School of Medicine embroidered on the pocket. She gathered her notes from the previous night, along with her student ID and other documents that might be relevant. Dr. William Taylor arrived exactly when he said he would. At 55, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with closely cropped gray hair, and the erect posture of someone who'd spent time in the military before becoming a surgeon. He wore a suit, as he always did when not in scrubs, and the subtle pin on his lapel, recognizable to those who knew what it meant, indicated his status as a decorated veteran. He gave his daughter a tight hug when she opened the door. You okay? Jasmine nodded. Better now that we're doing something about it. As they drove to the police station, Dr. Taylor shared stories from his early days as a medical resident, and later as the first black surgeon in his department. The casual racism, the constant need to prove himself, the assumptions that he'd only advanced through affirmative action rather than exceptional skill. It never completely goes away, he told her, his eyes fixed on the road. But you get better at handling it. And sometimes, Jasmine, sometimes you get the chance to make sure there are consequences. The Westbrook police station was a modern brick building downtown, American and state flags fluttering outside. As they walked in, Jasmine felt a flutter of nervousness, but her father's steady presence beside her kept her steps firm. The front desk was staffed by a young officer who looked up as they approached. Recognition flickered across his face when he saw Dr. Taylor. Good morning, Dr. Taylor said pleasantly but formally. My daughter would like to file a complaint about an incident that occurred last night involving one of your officers. The desk officer glanced between them, clearly trying to hide his surprise. Yes, sir. I can get you the forms for that. May I ask the nature of the complaint? Racial profiling, unprofessional conduct, and abuse of authority, Dr. Taylor replied calmly. The officer in question is Richard Dawson, badge number 4872. The desk officer's expression changed subtly. I see. Let me call Sergeant Reynolds to assist you with this. He handles most of our internal affairs matters. As the officer picked up the phone, Jasmine exchanged a look with her father. The wheels were already turning. A few minutes later, a door opened and a middle-aged man in a police uniform with sergeant's stripes approached them. Dr. Taylor, he said, extending his hand. I wasn't expecting to see you until the committee meeting next week. Sergeant Reynolds, Dr. Taylor replied, shaking his hand. This isn't a committee matter. This is personal. My daughter, Jasmine Taylor, second-year medical student at Westbrook University, had an encounter with one of your officers last night that we feel needs to be addressed. Sergeant Reynolds turned to Jasmine with a much more serious expression. Ms. Taylor, I'm sorry to hear that. Would you prefer to discuss this in private? Yes, please. Jasmine replied. They were led to a small conference room where Sergeant Reynolds provided them with complaint forms and listened attentively as Jasmine recounted the events of the previous night. She spoke clearly and precisely, referencing her notes when necessary, describing Officer Dawson's words and actions without embellishment, but without minimizing their impact either. "Do you have any witnesses or evidence of this interaction?" Sergeant Reynolds asked when she finished. "There were several people who drove by during the incident," Jasmine replied. "I recognize some as residents from my apartment complex, but I don't know their names." As for evidence, she hesitated, then reached for her phone. "I didn't record the entire encounter, but after the sobriety tests, when Officer Dawson made the comment about people like you and told me to stay in my own neighborhood, I did manage to record that part." She played the brief audio clip. Officer Dawson's voice came through clearly, his contemptuous tone unmistakable. Sergeant Reynolds' expression darkened as he listened. "This is very helpful, Ms. Taylor," he said when the recording ended, "and very concerning. I'd like to bring Captain Hernandez into this discussion, with your permission. He's the head of our patrol division and Officer Dawson's commanding officer." Dr. Taylor nodded. "That would be appropriate." As Sergeant Reynolds stepped out to call Captain Hernandez, Jasmine turned to her father. "Do you think anything will actually happen?" she asked quietly. "Yes," her father replied with certainty. "Because you have evidence, because you're articulate and credible, and because, frankly, the timing couldn't be worse for them to have an officer caught making openly racist remarks. The department is under scrutiny right now, and they know it." Captain Hernandez arrived a few minutes later, a stern-faced man with salt and pepper hair who introduced himself formally before taking a seat. Jasmine noticed how he addressed her father with obvious respect, calling him Dr. Taylor and referencing their previous meeting about community policing initiatives. "Ms. Taylor," Captain Hernandez said, turning to her, "I understand you had a troubling encounter with Officer Dawson last night. I'd like to hear about it directly from you if you don't mind repeating it." Jasmine recounted the story once more, and again played the audio recording. The captain's expression remained professional, but his jaw tightened noticeably as he listened. "I want to assure you, this is not the standard of conduct we expect from our officers," Captain Hernandez said when she finished. "I apologize for your experience, and I thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation, and in the meantime," Dr. Taylor asked pointedly. Captain Hernandez met his gaze directly. "In the meantime, Officer Dawson will be placed on administrative duties, desk work, while we investigate. And I'd like to speak with him today if possible." He turned to Sergeant Reynolds. "Is Dawson on duty?" "He comes in at noon, sir. He's working second shift today." "Good. I want to see him in my office the moment he arrives." The captain turned back to Jasmine and her father. "We take these allegations very seriously, especially given the evidence you've provided. You'll be kept informed of the process and outcome of our investigation." As they completed the necessary paperwork, filing the official complaint, Jasmine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She was being heard. Her experience was being validated, and Officer Dawson would face consequences for his actions. What none of them realized was that at that very moment, Officer Richard Dawson was pulling into the station parking lot, arriving early for his shift, and he was about to walk into a situation that would change the course of his career. Officer Richard Dawson arrived at the station 30 minutes before his shift was scheduled to begin. He liked getting there early to grab coffee, chat with the guys from the previous shift, and ease into his workday. At 38, Dawson had been with the Westbrook Police Department for 12 years, and he'd settled into a comfortable routine. He wasn't a standout officer, but he wasn't a problem either, at least not on paper. His record showed adequate performance reviews, a handful of commendations for routine matters, and no formal complaints. What his record didn't show was how he treated certain people during traffic stops when there were no cameras around. It didn't show the subtle intimidation tactics, the unnecessary searches, the skeptical questioning of credentials when the driver didn't match his expectations. These behaviors had become so ingrained that Dawson hardly noticed them anymore. In his mind, he was just being thorough, doing his job, keeping the community safe. He strolled into the station, nodding to a couple of officers on their way out. He noticed an unfamiliar car in the visitors' parking area, a sleek black Mercedes with medical staff parking permits. From Memorial Hospital. Nice ride, he thought absently, wondering which doctor had business at the police station today. At the front desk, Officer Chen was on the phone, but he gave Dawson a look that seemed oddly tense. Dawson raised an eyebrow in silent question, but Chen just shook his head slightly and continued his call. Shrugging it off, Dawson headed for the break room to pour himself some coffee. He was stirring in creamer when Sergeant Reynolds appeared in the doorway. "Dawson, Captain wants to see you in his office now." Something in Reynolds' tone made Dawson's stomach tighten. "I'm not even on duty yet." "What's this about?" "Just get to his office," Reynolds replied, already turning away. "And don't make him wait." Confused and increasingly concerned, Dawson abandoned his coffee and headed for Captain Hernandez's office. The captain was a fair man but strict about protocol and professional standards. Being summoned to his office was rarely a good thing. As he approached the captain's door, Dawson heard voices inside. He knocked twice, then entered when instructed to do so. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Captain Hernandez sat behind his desk, his expression grave. Sergeant Reynolds stood to one side. But it was the other two people in the room that caused Dawson's step to falter. A young black woman in a white medical coat, and an older black man in an expensive suit. The woman he recognized immediately from the previous night's traffic stop. The man, however— "Officer Dawson," Captain Hernandez said, his voice clipped. "You know Sergeant Reynolds. Let me introduce you to Dr. William Taylor, Chief of Surgery at Memorial Hospital and newly appointed member of our city's Police Oversight Committee." He paused, letting the information sink in. "And this is his daughter, Jasmine Taylor, second-year medical student at Westbrook University." Dawson felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet. "Chief of Surgery? Oversight Committee?" He struggled to keep his expression neutral. But inside his mind was racing, replaying every word, every action from the previous night's encounter. "Ms. Taylor has filed a formal complaint regarding your conduct during a traffic stop last night," Captain Hernandez continued, his tone leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "She has provided a detailed account of the incident, including an audio recording of parts of your conversation." Dawson's eyes darted to Jasmine, who met his gaze with unwavering calm. She'd recorded him? His mind frantically tried to recall exactly what he'd said. The comments about people like you, the disbelief about her being a medical student, the remark about staying in your own neighborhood. "Jesus, sir, Dawson began, but Captain Hernandez held up a hand to silence him. "Before you say anything, Officer Dawson, I want you to understand the gravity of the allegations. Ms. Taylor has described behavior that violates department policy on multiple levels. Racial profiling, unnecessary escalation, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer." The captain's eyes were hard. "We've already reviewed the audio recording and found it consistent with Ms. Taylor's account." Dawson swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Captain, if I could explain—" "You'll have ample opportunity to provide your side of the story," Captain Hernandez interrupted. "For now, I want you to understand what happens next. You're being temporarily reassigned to administrative duties while we conduct a full investigation. You'll surrender your service weapon to Sergeant Reynolds and report to records tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Dawson felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Desk duty. It was a public demotion, something everyone in the department would know about by the end of the day. His reputation, his standing among his fellow officers, all of it would take a hit. And if the investigation went against him— He glanced at Dr. Taylor, trying to gauge the man. The chief surgeon's expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes held something that made Dawson distinctly uncomfortable. Not anger, but a kind of patient, calculated assessment, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Officer Dawson," Dr. Taylor spoke for the first time, his voice deep and measured, "I want you to know that my daughter and I aren't interested in destroying your career. What we're interested in is accountability, change, and ensuring that what happened last night doesn't happen to someone else tomorrow." The statement, delivered so calmly, somehow made Dawson feel worse than if the man had shouted at him. There was a dignity in Dr. Taylor's manner that made Dawson acutely aware of his own behavior the previous night. "I understand, sir," Dawson managed to reply, though he wasn't sure he understood anything at this moment, except that he was in serious trouble. "Good," Dr. Taylor said with a slight nod, "because this incident has highlighted some systemic issues that need to be addressed. Captain Hernandez and I have already discussed the possibility of implementing additional training for the entire department, on implicit bias and community relations. Dawson realized with a sinking feeling that this had already escalated, far beyond a simple complaint. This was becoming a departmental issue, a policy matter, and he was the face of the problem. Captain Hernandez cleared his throat. Dr. Taylor and Ms. Taylor have been very forthcoming and cooperative. I've assured them that we take these allegations seriously and will conduct a thorough investigation. He fixed Dawson with a stern look. Officer Dawson, you'll provide a detailed written statement about the incident before you leave today. Sergeant Reynolds will take your statement in interview room 2. Yes, sir, Dawson replied automatically. That will be all for now, the captain concluded. Dr. Taylor, Ms. Taylor, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We'll be in touch regarding the progress of our investigation. Dr. Taylor and Jasmine rose to leave. As they passed Dawson, Dr. Taylor paused briefly. Officer Dawson, he said quietly, I hope this becomes a learning opportunity rather than just a disciplinary matter. My daughter is going to be an excellent physician someday, just as I'm sure you once hoped to be an excellent police officer. It's never too late to recommit to that goal. With that, they left, leaving Dawson standing stiffly in the captain's office, feeling as if his entire professional identity was crumbling around him after providing his statement, a sanitized version of events that omitted his worst comments but couldn't entirely explain away the recorded evidence. Dawson headed to his locker to change out of his uniform. He wouldn't be on patrol today after all, maybe not for a long time, if ever again. As he changed into civilian clothes, Officer Chen approached cautiously. Heard what happened, he said. Tough break, man. Dawson slammed his locker shut. You know what the worst part is? I didn't even think about it. It was just another traffic stop to me. Just another person who didn't look like they belonged in that neighborhood. Chen frowned. You couldn't have known who she was, who her father was. That's just it, Dawson replied, the realization hitting him fully for the first time. I shouldn't have treated her that way regardless of who her father is. She told me she was a medical student. She was polite, cooperative. She didn't deserve what I did. He shook his head. And now I've got the chief of surgery gunning for me, the captain questioning my judgment and my whole career hanging in the balance. What are you going to do? Chen asked. Dawson stared at his reflection in the small mirror inside his locker door. He hardly recognized the man looking back at him, not just physically but in a deeper sense. Who was he really? What kind of officer had he become? I don't know, he answered honestly. I really don't know. As he left the station, Dawson spotted a familiar black Mercedes still in the visitor's lot. Dr. Taylor was standing beside it, apparently taking a phone call. Their eyes met briefly across the parking lot, and Dr. Taylor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning away to continue his conversation. In that moment, something shifted inside Richard Dawson. The nod hadn't been gloating or threatening. It had been acknowledgement, one professional to another. And somehow that simple gesture of respect, given after everything that had happened, hit Dawson harder than any reprimand could have. He drove home in silence, his mind replaying not just the previous night's traffic stop, but dozens of others over the years. How many Jasmine Taylors had there been? How many people had he humiliated, intimidated, or treated unfairly because of assumptions he'd made based on their appearance? How had he allowed himself to become this person? By the time he reached his small suburban home, Dawson had made a decision. Whatever happened with the investigation, whatever disciplinary action came his way, he would use this as a turning point. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he would find his way back to the officer he had once aspired to be, someone who protected and served everyone in his community with equal respect and dignity. The irony wasn't lost on him that this resolution came only after being caught, only after facing consequences. But maybe that's how change often began, not with a noble epiphany, but with the stark reality of accountability. As he unlocked his front door, Dawson's phone buzzed with a text message from his partner, wondering where he was and why he wasn't on patrol. Dawson stared at the message, considering how to respond, how to explain what had happened without sounding defensive or self-pitying. Finally, he typed, "Got myself in trouble. Big trouble. We'll explain later, but it's on me and I'm going to fix it." He hit send, then put the phone away. It was the first step in what would be a long and difficult journey toward redemption, if redemption was even possible after today. 3 weeks passed. For Jasmine, life continued its demanding pace. Lectures, clinical rotations, study groups, and exams. The incident with Officer Dawson remained in the back of her mind, but the immediate shock and anger had faded. She'd received an official letter from the Westbrook Police Department informing her that her complaint was being taken seriously, and an investigation was underway. Beyond that, she heard nothing, until a Tuesday afternoon in October, when she received a call from Captain Hernandez himself. "Ms. Taylor, I wanted to update you personally on the status of your complaint against Officer Dawson," he said. "The internal investigation has been completed, and we've found sufficient evidence to substantiate your allegations." Jasmine sat down at her kitchen table, surprised by the call and the directness of the captain's statement. "I appreciate you letting me know, Captain. What happens now?" "Officer Dawson has been issued a formal reprimand that will remain in his permanent record. He's been suspended without pay for 2 weeks, and he'll remain on administrative duty for an additional month after returning. Most importantly, he'll be required to complete an extensive training program on implicit bias, professional conduct, and community relations." Jasmine absorbed this information, trying to determine how she felt about it. Part of her had expected, maybe even hoped, that Dawson would be fired. But another part of her recognized that termination wouldn't necessarily lead to any real change, either in Dawson himself or in the department culture. "Do you think the training will make a difference?" she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. Captain Hernandez paused before answering, as if considering his words carefully. "I believe it can, Ms. Taylor. But if I may speak frankly, the most significant factor in Officer Dawson's case isn't the formal disciplinary action or even the mandatory training. It's that this incident has forced him to confront aspects of himself and his conduct that he'd previously ignored or justified. He's actually acknowledged what he did." Jasmine couldn't hide her surprise. "Yes," the captain confirmed. In fact, his written statement went beyond just admitting to the specific incident. He acknowledged a pattern of behavior that's been problematic for some time. Another pause. "I've been with this department for 23 years, Ms. Taylor. I've seen officers receive disciplinary action and go right back to their old ways. But I've also seen a few who genuinely change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. The difference usually lies in whether they take personal responsibility or just see themselves as victims of the system." "And which category does Officer Dawson fall into?" Jasmine asked. "I believe he's in the former category, but only time will tell. What I can tell you is that your complaint has had ripple effects beyond just Officer Dawson. Your father's position on the Oversight Committee has given this incident additional visibility, and as a result, we're implementing department-wide changes in training and accountability measures." After ending the call, Jasmine immediately phoned her father to share the update. Dr. Taylor wasn't surprised. "Captain Hernandez mentioned this was coming when we spoke at the committee meeting last week," he said. "He seems genuinely committed to making changes, not just handling this as an isolated incident." "Do you think Dawson will actually change, Dad?" Jasmine asked. Her father was silent for a moment. "People can change, Jasmine. It's rare, and it usually requires both a significant emotional impact and a genuine desire to be better. Whether Officer Dawson has those elements, I don't know. But I do know that regardless of his personal journey, your actions have set in motion changes that will affect many others." This thought gave Jasmine a sense of satisfaction that went beyond any punishment Dawson might receive. Systems didn't change overnight, but sometimes all it took was one incident, one push in the right direction, to begin a transformation. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Dawson sat in a classroom at the police academy, listening to a lecture on racial profiling and implicit bias. It was his 3rd day of the 2-week intensive training program that formed part of his disciplinary action. The first 2 days had been uncomfortable, defensive, even anger-inducing at times. Today, however, something had shifted. The instructor, a former police officer turned social psychologist, had been discussing the concept of confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in a way that confirms one's existing beliefs. He'd shown videos of traffic stops and asked the officers in the class to identify potential biases in the handling of each situation. The most dangerous thing about these biases, the instructor explained, is that they operate largely outside our conscious awareness. We don't wake up in the morning and decide to be unfair or discriminatory. Instead, we make split-second judgments based on a lifetime of accumulated associations and assumptions. As examples played out on screen, Dawson found himself recognizing patterns that hit uncomfortably close to home. The way officers approached certain vehicles differently based on the driver's appearance, the different language used, the escalation that occurred when preconceived expectations met resistance. During a break, Dawson stood alone by the coffee machine, lost in thought. He'd spent the first 2 days mentally arguing with much of what was being taught, seeing it as an attack on police officers, a capitulation to political correctness. Today he was simply listening, and what he heard resonated with truths he'd long ignored. "Rough day?" a voice asked beside him. Dawson turned to see another officer, Lopez, who was attending the training voluntarily as part of a leadership development program. "Just thinking," Dawson replied, stirring his coffee absently. "About the Taylor case?" Lopez asked. Word had spread quickly through the department about Dawson's encounter with a medical student, who turned out to be the daughter of Dr. William Taylor. Dawson nodded. "Not just that specific case. About all of it. Years of traffic stops, interactions, decisions made in a split second." He shook his head. "I've always told myself I'm a good cop who treats everyone fairly. But when I really look at it, I'm not sure that's true." Lopez seemed surprised by the candor. "Most guys in your situation would be focused on how to get back on patrol, not questioning their whole approach to the job." "Maybe that's part of the problem," Dawson said quietly. "Too much concern about getting back to business as usual. Not enough about whether usual is actually right." When the training resumed, Dawson found himself fully engaged, taking notes, asking questions, not to challenge or undermine, but to understand. By the end of the day, he felt mentally exhausted but somehow lighter, as if he'd set down a heavy burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. That evening, sitting at his kitchen table with case studies and reading materials spread before him, Dawson made a decision. He picked up his phone and, after hesitating briefly, composed an email to Captain Hernandez requesting permission to speak with Jasmine Taylor. It was a risky move. The standard procedure in these situations was to maintain distance between the officer and the complainant. But Dawson felt increasingly that a formal disciplinary process, while necessary, wasn't sufficient. There was something more personal at stake here, an acknowledgement that needed to be made directly, not filtered through official channels and bureaucratic language. To his surprise, Captain Hernandez responded within the hour. "Officer Dawson, I'll reach out to Ms. Taylor to see if she's willing to meet with you. No promises. In the meantime, I'd suggest reflecting carefully on what you hope to accomplish with such a meeting, and what you're prepared to say. This isn't about making yourself feel better. It's about taking genuine responsibility." The captain's words stung, but Dawson recognized their truth. Was he seeking this meeting to ease his own conscience, or was there a more substantive purpose? He spent much of the night considering this question, examining his motives with a newfound critical eye. By morning, he had his answer. This wasn't about alleviating his guilt or rehabilitating his image. It was about facing directly the person he had wronged and acknowledging that wrong without excuses or justifications. It was about taking a first step toward being not just a different kind of officer, but a different kind of person. Whether Jasmine Taylor would be willing to take that step with him remained to be seen. 2 days later, Captain Hernandez called Dawson into his office. "Ms. Taylor has agreed to meet with you," he said without preamble. "Next Tuesday, 4 p.m. at the community center on Elm Street. Neutral ground." He fixed Dawson with a stern look. "Don't make me regret facilitating this." "I won't, sir," Dawson promised. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," the captain replied. Ms. Taylor specified that her father will also be present. Dr. Taylor has agreed to this meeting not just as Jasmine's father, but in his capacity as a member of the Oversight Committee. This will be a formal conversation, not a casual chat. Dawson nodded, understanding the implications. This would be on the record, potentially with consequences beyond those already imposed. "I understand, sir. That's appropriate." As he left the captain's office, Dawson felt a mixture of anxiety and strange relief. The meeting would be difficult, perhaps one of the most challenging conversations of his life. but it represented an opportunity, not for redemption, which felt too grand a concept for what he deserved, but for honest acknowledgement of harm done and a commitment to do better. The days until Tuesday passed with agonizing slowness. Dawson continued his training, now approaching each session with genuine openness rather than reluctant compliance. He reviewed his record, looking back at years of traffic stops, arrests, and civilian interactions with newly critical eyes. The patterns were undeniable once he allowed himself to see them. When Tuesday finally arrived, Dawson dressed carefully in civilian clothes, not to hide his identity as a police officer, but to meet the Taylors as a person first, an individual taking responsibility for his actions rather than hiding behind a uniform and badge. The community center on Elm Street was a modern building that housed various neighborhood programs and services. Dawson arrived 15 minutes early, his stomach tight with apprehension. He waited in the small meeting room that had been reserved, rehearsing what he wanted to say while knowing that no prepared speech would be adequate for the situation. At precisely 4 p.m., the door opened and Jasmine Taylor walked in, followed by her father. Seeing her again not through the lens of a traffic stop but in this context, Dawson was struck by her poise and composure. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, no white coat today, but carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. Dr. William Taylor closed the door behind them, his expression neutral but watchful. Today, in a tailored suit and tie, he looked every inch the chief surgeon and oversight committee member, a man accustomed to authority and responsibility. Ms. Taylor. Dr. Taylor, Dawson said, standing as they entered. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Jasmine nodded but said nothing as she took a seat across the table from him. Her father sat beside her, his gaze steady and assessing. Before we begin, Dr. Taylor said, I want to be clear about the purpose of this meeting. This is not about absolution or forgiveness, Officer Dawson. This is about accountability and moving forward in a constructive way. Are we understood? Yes, sir, Dawson replied. That's exactly why I requested this meeting. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to take full responsibility for my actions and to listen to anything Ms. Taylor wants to say to me directly. Dr. Taylor nodded, then turned to his daughter. Jasmine? Jasmine looked directly at Dawson, her expression composed but her eyes reflecting a complex mix of emotions. I agreed to this meeting because I believe in the possibility of change, she said. Not just for you personally, Officer Dawson, but for the system you're part of. I'm here to listen to what you have to say, but also to make sure you understand the full impact of that night from my perspective. I would like to hear that, Dawson said quietly. I've spent these past weeks trying to understand, but I know I can't fully grasp what that experience was like for you. And so, with remarkable clarity and control, Jasmine described again what the traffic stop had felt like from her side. The fear, the humiliation, the anger, and most painfully, the familiarity of it all. This wasn't an isolated incident in her life. It was part of a pattern of experiences that had followed her since childhood, through college, and now into medical school. When you questioned whether I was really a medical student, she said, you weren't just questioning my ID card. You were questioning my right to be there, my capability, my future, and you did it based on nothing but how I look. Her words hit Dawson like physical blows. He'd known his behavior was wrong, but hearing directly from Jasmine the depth of its impact made him realize how profoundly he had failed in his duty, as an officer and as a human being. When she finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence before Dawson responded. Ms. Taylor, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. There is nothing I can say that would adequately address what you've just described. What I did was wrong on every level, not just unprofessional or against policy, but fundamentally wrong as one person treating another person. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I could offer explanations about stress or training or department culture, but those would just be excuses. The truth is simpler and harder to face. I made assumptions about you based on your race, and I treated you with suspicion and disrespect because of those assumptions. Dawson looked from Jasmine to Dr. Taylor and back again. I am sorry, not just because I got caught, not just because there were consequences, but because I violated the oath I took to serve and protect all members of this community equally. I failed you, and I failed others before you in ways I'm only now beginning to fully recognize. Dr. Taylor's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes shifted slightly. "And now?" he asked. "Where do you go from here, Officer Dawson?" It was the question Dawson had been asking himself for weeks. The easy answer would be to say I'll do better, that I've learned my lesson. But I think the more honest answer is that this is just the beginning of a process. The training I'm receiving is valuable, but it's just a framework. The real work happens in daily decisions, in constant self-examination, in being willing to recognize and confront biases that I've spent years denying or ignoring. He looked directly at Jasmine. "I can't undo what happened that night. I can't erase the experience you had or the feelings it caused. All I can do is commit to the work of changing, not just for 2 weeks or 2 months, but permanently. And not just in how I act, but in how I think and what I believe about people who don't look like me." For the first time, Jasmine's composed expression softened slightly. "That's a difficult commitment to make, Officer Dawson. Change doesn't happen overnight." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "But it has to start somewhere. For me, it started with you standing up and holding me accountable. And for that, despite everything, I'm grateful." The conversation continued for another hour, moving from the specific incident to broader issues of policing, community relations, and systemic change. Dr. Taylor spoke about the work of the Oversight Committee and the changes being implemented department-wide. Dawson shared insights from his training and the personal reckoning it had prompted. As the meeting drew to a close, Dr. Taylor made a surprising proposal. "Officer Dawson, once you've completed your training and suspension period, the Oversight Committee will be looking for officers to participate in a new community engagement initiative. Specifically, a series of facilitated conversations between police and community members about race, bias, and trust. Based on what I've heard today, I think you might have a valuable perspective to contribute. Would you be interested?" Dawson was momentarily speechless. It was the last thing he'd expected from this meeting. Not just accountability, but an opportunity to be part of the solution. "Yes, sir," he said finally. "I would be very interested in that." As they prepared to leave, Jasmine offered her hand to Dawson. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. An acknowledgement, if not of forgiveness, then of a shared commitment to something better. "Good luck with your training, Officer Dawson," she said. "I hope it's the beginning of real change for you and for others." "Thank you for being willing to meet with me," he replied, shaking her hand. "And for having the courage to speak up in the first place. Not everyone would have done that. Not everyone could," she corrected him gently. "Not everyone has a father who's a chief surgeon and sits on the Oversight Committee. Not everyone has the resources or knowledge to navigate the complaint process. Not everyone would be believed." Her words hung in the air between them, a reminder of privilege and power, of systemic inequities that went far beyond one traffic stop or one officer's behavior. It was another truth Dawson needed to face, another layer of understanding he needed to develop. "I'll remember that," he said quietly. "I'll try to remember all of this." As the Taylors left, Dawson remained seated in the meeting room, processing everything that had been said. The conversation had been difficult, painful at times, but also clarifying. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of direction, a path forward that, while challenging, at least led somewhere worth going. His phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Hernandez. "How did it go?" Dawson considered how to respond. There was no simple answer, no neat conclusion to what had happened today or to the journey he was beginning. Finally, he typed, "It went as it needed to. I have a lot of work to do, but I'm ready to do it." 6 months later, the Westbrook Community Center was buzzing with activity. The large meeting room had been arranged with chairs in a circle rather than the usual rows, creating an atmosphere of equality and open dialogue. A diverse group of people filed in. Community members of various ages and backgrounds, uniformed police officers, local officials, and healthcare workers. Among them were Jasmine Taylor, now halfway through her second year of medical school, and Officer Richard Dawson, recently returned to active patrol duty after completing his training and administrative assignment. Today marked the launch of the Westbrook Community Dialogue Initiative, a program developed by the Police Oversight Committee to foster better understanding and communication between law enforcement and the communities they served. Dr. William Taylor had been instrumental in creating the program, working closely with Captain Hernandez to design a framework that went beyond superficial community relations to address deeper issues of bias, trust, and accountability. As Jasmine took her seat, she spotted Officer Dawson on the opposite side of the circle. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded in acknowledgement. She returned the gesture, noting the changes in him since their meeting 6 months earlier. He seemed different somehow, less rigid, more present. Whether that represented genuine transformation or just her own shifting perception, she couldn't be sure. The session began with introductions, each participant sharing not just their name and role, but also their hopes for the dialogue process. When it was Jasmine's turn, she spoke clearly and confidently. "I'm Jasmine Taylor, second-year medical student at Westbrook University. I'm here because I believe that difficult conversations are necessary for meaningful change. And because I've seen firsthand both the harm that can come from misuse of authority and the possibility of growth that can follow accountability." Several people nodded in agreement, though few knew the specific incident she was referencing. When Officer Dawson's turn came, his response seemed to echo hers. "I'm Richard Dawson, patrol officer with Westbrook PD. I'm here because I've learned that being a good police officer means being willing to examine your own actions and assumptions, and because I believe that serving the community starts with truly understanding the community, all members of it." The dialogue that followed was challenging, but productive. Facilitators guided the group through exercises designed to build empathy and understanding, interspersed with open discussions about specific issues: racial profiling, use of force, community oversight, and implicit bias. Participants shared personal experiences, asked difficult questions, and sometimes disagreed passionately but respectfully. During a small group breakout session, Jasmine found herself working with Officer Dawson and 3 other participants on a case study involving a traffic stop gone wrong. As they analyzed what had happened and how it might have been handled differently, Dawson spoke up. "6 months ago, I wouldn't have seen anything wrong with how the officer in this scenario acted," he admitted. "I would have focused on procedural correctness and officer safety without considering how the driver experienced the interaction or questioning the assumptions that led to the stop in the first place." An older black woman in their group, Mrs. Johnson, looked at him skeptically. "What changed?" she asked. Dawson hesitated, then glanced at Jasmine. "I had an experience that forced me to confront my own biases and behavior. I pulled someone over based on assumptions I'd made, treated them disrespectfully, and later found out they were not who I thought they were." He chose his words carefully, not mentioning Jasmine directly. "You mean you got caught?" Mrs. Johnson said bluntly. "Yes, ma'am, I did," Dawson acknowledged without defensiveness. "And at first, that's what bothered me most. The fact that I got caught, that there were consequences. But through the process that followed, I started to understand that the real problem wasn't getting caught. The real problem was that I'd been behaving that way for years and had justified it to myself as good policing." His honesty seemed to surprise Mrs. Johnson, who nodded slowly. "Well, at least you're being straight about it." "That's a start." "It is just a start," Dawson agreed. "I'm still learning, still catching myself making assumptions, still having to consciously choose different actions sometimes. But I'm trying." When the breakout groups rejoined the larger circle to share insights, Jasmine noticed a subtle but significant shift in the energy of the room. The initial tension had eased somewhat, replaced by a tentative openness. People were still cautious, still skeptical in many cases, but they were listening to each other. It wasn't harmony or perfect understanding, but it was dialogue. Real dialogue that acknowledged problems and sought solutions rather than simply talking past each other. As the session wrapped up, Dr. William Taylor addressed the group. "This is just the beginning of what we hope will be an ongoing conversation in our community. Change doesn't happen in one meeting or one training session. It happens through sustained effort, through policies and practices that promote accountability, and through relationships built on mutual respect and understanding." Afterward, as people mingled informally, Jasmine found herself face to face with Officer Dawson. "Ms. Taylor," he greeted her. "It's good to see you again." "Officer Dawson," she replied. "How has it been being back on patrol?" "Different," he said after a moment's reflection. "I'm approaching the job differently, seeing interactions through a new lens. Some of my colleagues think I've gone soft, become too hesitant. Others have actually started asking questions, becoming more thoughtful about their own approaches." He paused. "It's a process," Jasmine nodded. Most worthwhile things are. Your father mentioned you'll be speaking at the police academy next month, Dawson said. About medical perspectives on implicit bias. Yes, Jasmine confirmed. It's part of a new curriculum they're developing. I'll be discussing how bias affects healthcare outcomes and drawing parallels to law enforcement scenarios. I think it will be valuable, Dawson said. Sometimes it's easier to recognize problems in a different field before applying those insights to your own profession. A moment of silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with the journey that had brought them to this point. I want you to know, Dawson said finally, that what happened that night, what I did, is something I think about almost every day on the job. Not with guilt or shame, though there was plenty of that at first, but as a reminder to check myself, to question my instincts when they might be based on bias rather than actual behavior or circumstances. That's good to hear, Jasmine replied, though I hope someday it becomes so ingrained that you don't have to consciously think about it anymore. That's the goal, he agreed. But I'm not there yet. As they parted ways, Jasmine felt a sense of cautious optimism. The incident that had brought them together had been painful and unjust, but out of it had come something valuable, not just for her and Officer Dawson, but potentially for the broader community. Later that evening, Jasmine called her father to discuss the session. It went well, I think, she told him. People were engaged, honest. Even when things got tense, they stayed in the conversation. That's what we were hoping for, Dr. Taylor replied. Not instant harmony, but genuine dialogue. The real test will be whether it continues, whether it leads to concrete changes in policy and behavior. I spoke with Officer Dawson briefly, Jasmine mentioned. He seems different. Her father made a thoughtful sound. Captain Hernandez says he's been one of the most committed participants in the training programs. He's even started mentoring newer officers, encouraging them to think critically about their approaches to community interactions. Do you think it's genuine? Jasmine asked. The change in him? Dr. Taylor considered the question. I believe it is. People can change, Jasmine, especially when they're confronted with the consequences of their actions in a way that forces genuine self-reflection. Not everyone does, of course. Many double down, become defensive, or make surface-level adjustments while maintaining the same underlying attitudes. But some do the harder work of examining and changing their fundamental assumptions and behaviors. And you think Dawson is one of those? I think he's trying to be, her father said. Time will tell if he sustains it. But even if he does, he's just one officer. The broader changes we're working toward require institutional commitment, policy reform, and cultural shift within the department and the community. One person at a time, one policy at a time, Jasmine said, echoing a phrase her father often used when discussing systemic change. Exactly, Dr. Taylor replied. Which reminds me, how's your presentation for the police academy coming along? That's an opportunity to influence a whole cohort of future officers. As Jasmine described her plans for the presentation, she reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this point. What had begun as a traumatic traffic stop had evolved into involvement with police reform efforts, speaking engagements, and a deeper understanding of her own power to effect change. A month later, Jasmine stood at a podium in the Westbrook Police Academy auditorium, facing a room full of cadets and training officers. Her presentation, Implicit Bias in Professional Decision-Making, Lessons from Medicine for Law, Enforcement, drew parallels between how unconscious biases affected treatment decisions in healthcare and enforcement decisions in policing. In both our fields, she explained, split-second decisions can have life-altering consequences. And in both fields, those decisions are vulnerable to influences we may not even be aware of. Assumptions and associations that operate below the level of conscious thought. As she spoke, she noticed Officer Dawson sitting in the back row. He had asked permission to attend, though the session wasn't part of his required training. Their eyes met briefly and he nodded in encouragement. Jasmine continued, describing research studies that documented disparities in pain management, diagnostic testing, and treatment recommendations based on patients' race, gender, or socioeconomic status. She then drew connections to similar patterns in traffic stops, searches, and use of force decisions. The good news, she concluded, is that awareness is the first step toward change. By acknowledging these biases exist, by implementing systems that help counter them, And by committing to ongoing self-examination, we can make better, more equitable decisions, whether we're treating patients or protecting communities. The questions that followed were thoughtful and engaged. One cadet asked about specific strategies for recognizing bias in the moment before it influenced an action. Another wanted to know how medical schools were addressing these issues in their training programs. A third asked about the role of community feedback in identifying problematic patterns. After the formal Q&A ended, several cadets approached Jasmine to continue the conversation. As the group gradually dispersed, Officer Dawson made his way to the podium. "That was excellent, Miss Taylor," he said, "especially the part about systems and protocols that help counter individual biases. I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of our department's policies." "Thank you," Jasmine replied. "Have you had any thoughts about specific changes that might help?" "Actually, yes." Dawson seemed almost eager now, animated in a way she hadn't seen before. "I've been working with a couple of other officers to develop a proposal for revising our traffic stop procedures. Nothing dramatic, just adjustments to standard protocols that might reduce the influence of subjective judgment in the initial decision to pull someone over and in how the interaction proceeds." Jasmine listened with interest as he outlined the proposal. Requirements for documenting, specific observable violations before initiating stops, standardized scripts for initial interactions to ensure consistency, body camera reviews that looked at patterns rather than just individual incidents. "It's still in the early stages," Dawson admitted. "We'll need buy-in from senior officers and administration, but Captain Hernandez has been supportive so far. And your father suggested it might be something the Oversight Committee would back if we can demonstrate potential effectiveness." "It sounds promising," Jasmine said. "Genuinely impressed by the thoughtfulness of the approach. I'd be interested in seeing the full proposal when it's ready." As they walked together toward the exit, Dawson hesitated, then spoke in a quieter tone. "Ms. Taylor, I know we've had several professional interactions now and we've both been very proper about it all, but I just wanted to say person to person that I'm sorry for what happened that night. Truly sorry." Jasmine studied him for a moment, seeing not the intimidating officer who had humiliated her on the roadside, but a man who had been humbled, who had faced his failings, and who was working to become better. "I know you are," she said simply. "I don't expect forgiveness," Dawson continued. "That's not what this is about. I just wanted you to know that what you did, standing up, filing the complaint, agreeing to meet with me later, it changed things." "It changed me," Jasmine thought carefully before responding. Forgiveness was complex, personal. She had moved past the acute anger and hurt of that night. But forgiveness wasn't something she could simply declare on demand. "What I can tell you," she said finally, "is that I respect the work you're doing now. The fact that you've taken this experience and used it as a catalyst for genuine change, not just in yourself but in trying to improve the system, that matters. It means that what happened, as unpleasant as it was, wasn't for nothing." Dawson nodded, accepting this response for what it was, not absolution, but acknowledgement of a shared journey toward something better. As they parted ways outside the academy, Jasmine felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. The story that had begun with fear and humiliation on a dark roadside had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. Not a simple tale of villain and victim, but a human narrative of error, accountability, growth, and systemic change. Walking to her car, Jasmine thought about the patients she would treat in the future, the communities she would serve as a physician. The incident with Officer Dawson had reinforced her commitment to addressing bias in her own field, to being part of the solution rather than perpetuating problems. It had also shown her the power of standing up, of using her voice and privilege to create ripples that might eventually become waves. In the end, that night had changed both of them. Officer Dawson toward becoming a more self-aware, equitable police officer, and Jasmine toward becoming not just a skilled physician, but an advocate for fairness and dignity in all professional interactions. Different paths, different roles, but a shared commitment to the ongoing work of creating a more just society. One encounter, one policy, one person at a time.